What's up guys, it's Mitch here from Revolution Music, and today we're going to do a mic shootout between a dynamic microphone, a condenser microphone, and a ribbon microphone on my favorite guitar setup. It's going to be awesome. Stay tuned and see which mic wins it out. Welcome back to Revolution Music, where we talk about real home studio solutions that you can achieve on any budget and produce an awesome result. And if you like what I do here, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and comment down below. So today we're going to do a mic shootout with a difference. It's going to be a little different to what you're probably used to seeing on YouTube. We're actually going to shoot out 3 microphones that are very, very different and can be used quite differently in the studio to achieve very different results. First up, we got this guy, the SM57, if you can see it right here. Nice and beaten up as it should be, and these guys are one of the most popular microphones used on drums and guitars. They're found in live environments where we'd use them on guitars, drums, most notably snare drums, but they've also been used on vocals as well. And in the studio, we use them on similar things. We might use them on snare drums, we might use them on guitars, and they're a dynamic microphone, which means that there's a small diaphragm in the center of the microphone here. Under that is a coil, and that sends a small electrical signal down through the microphone into a transformer and then out, and they're designed to be very rugged and handle high sound pressure levels. And the reason why this microphone in particular has been popular for so many years is because if you're using it in a live situation, it can be dropped, it can be knocked around without copping too much damage. And the same goes for the studio, but it also has some very distinct sound qualities, most notably a nice mid-range bump that is really present on things like snare drums and guitars, which is probably why we use it on those things. And it also has a nice low range frequency response with a nice natural roll off that also suits those sound sources. But that's not to say it's only good on guitars and snare drums, it's good on toms. I use them on toms all the time, and they can also be used actually on vocals a lot. And some singers, live and in the studio, prefer an SM57 because of the characteristics that it can bring out. Number 2 in the shootout is one of my favorite microphones. It's this guy. A second here. It's the S12 from microphoneparts.com. It's a great microphone, and it's going to be our condenser for today. And it is voiced similarly to an AKG C414, one of my favorite microphones for overheads, but it's also been used on guitar cabs and a lot of different vocals. Some of my favorite hip hop artists have used it as their go-to vocal mic. And if you've never seen this microphone before, it's actually a DIY kit that I built myself. I did a review of it a while ago, and I'll put a link up to that here. And if you're interested in purchasing one, I'll put a link down below to micparts.com. They're great guys. They supply some awesome gear. Now, as a condenser microphone, this microphone typically has a flatter response across the frequency range, meaning that it has quite a flat frequency response with a nice roll off. It doesn't have any frequency characteristics that will stand out as aggressively as maybe the SM57, and it has a small dip around the 2 kilohertz range, which is why I like it on female vocals particularly and certain aggressive vocals. But it'll be interesting to see how it comes out on guitars today. And it also has a nice soft bump in the mid-range, nothing too hyped up like some cheaper Chinese condenser microphones. And the way they're different to a dynamic microphone is that they're phantom powered. They have a gold-plated electric diaphragm in the middle, and it requires a 48 volt signal to activate that backplate so that you can get signal from your desired sound source. They are typically much more responsive to transients because of this design, so you get a lot more attack from things like snare drums and even on guitars and other sound sources. And that's also why this microphone has been one of my favorite on acoustic guitars. It picks out the nice attack of an acoustic guitar without being too bright. So it'll be really interesting to see how it goes on electric guitar today. And last but not least is my favorite new microphone. It's a ribbon microphone from Bumblebee Pro Audio, and it's called the RM5, and it's this guy right here. And as I said earlier, it's a ribbon microphone, so it's quite different from the other 2 microphones that we're looking at today. I did a review on this microphone earlier, so if you're interested in seeing that, I'll put another link up here. But just so you know, a ribbon microphone is different to the other 2 microphones in that its diaphragm is a thin piece of foil suspended between 2 magnets. And that makes it very different to the other 2 microphones. And that's because this thin piece of foil, acting as a diaphragm, gives it what we call a figure 8 polar pattern. And that means whilst the other 2 microphones pick up from the front and reject from behind, this microphone actually picks up from both the front and the behind. And that gives it quite a bit of a different sound and some different characteristics to it, and a bit more roominess to it, and a bit more naturalness in a way that you can't really describe until you hear it. But one of the drawbacks is it's quite a fragile microphone if you're not careful with it, as opposed to something like the SM57, which you can knock around all day. And the guitar setup we're going to be using today is my trusty Fender Telecaster Affinity series, paired with my Boss GD6, running into my Vox AC M50 amp amp head into my Marshall 50-watt combo box. And that's my go-to setup for guitars at the moment. If you're curious about this setup, please hit me in the comment sections below. I know it's a bit of a peculiar setup, but it's something I've been working on for a long time and I like how it all works together. And I'm going to be playing some distorted guitar first, and then we're going to look at some clean guitars, and we're going to do an A/B comparison against all the microphones soloed, and then in the mix with some drums and bass, just so you can hear how those microphones each sit in the mix, and then with other instruments, because when you hear shootouts with microphones, usually you might just hear them soloed, but you're not hearing them in the mix. And if you don't hear how those microphones pick up those sound sources in a mix with other instruments, you might be able to hear the difference between those microphones, but you can't tell how that relationship works in the mix against other instruments. And that's going to be the focus of today's test. Each microphone is going to be volume matched in the preamp stage, and then I'm going to closely match them in the mix as well to make sure that there's no difference in volume that affects the way you hear the sounds. Because what actually kind of happens with human hearing is the louder the sound source, generally the better we think it sounds. So if they're all at the same volume, you're going to hear them in the truest way possible by comparison. And before we get into recording any guitars, I want to explain also what's going to be different about our setup today. So with these microphones, they all have a different way that they're usually placed to a sound source to capture the best quality sound. So for instance, an SM57 is typically placed quite close to the sound source because it's a dynamic microphone. It needs to be close to the sound source to get the best frequency response. The condenser microphone, the S12, is going to be placed similarly close to the guitar amp, but a little bit off axis. And the ribbon microphone is actually going to be pushed a little bit further away from the guitar amp. And we're doing this because this is where those mics would typically actually be placed in a recording situation. On most microphone shootouts, you will see people place all the microphones up against the amp, then move them away, and they'll do those direct comparisons, but that's not really what I want to compare today. What I want to compare today is each microphone in its prime position, where it's best located to pick up the best response, and then compare those sounds. Because a microphone like the ribbon mic that we're going to be using today sounds generally horrible up too close to a guitar amp because of the proximity effect it creates around the ribbon. You typically wouldn't find a ribbon ever that close to the sound source it was trying to record. So what we're going to go for today is the best application of those microphones and then compare that. So up first we've got the SM57, then we've got the S12, then we've got the ribbon microphone in each sample. Alright, so let's get into it. First up is going to be the SM57 soloed with distortion. So if you've given those a listen, let me know down below what you thought so far of those sound samples. Personally, I think the SM57 sounded pretty great on its own in the mix, and I thought it didn't actually sound too bad in the mix with the drums and bass either. It definitely has more of a mid-rangey sort of sound, but it sits well in the mix. And keep in mind, this is with no EQ on any of these tracks. So with the S12 with the distorted guitar, I actually didn't quite like it at all. I thought it sounded a bit empty, a bit hollow, and I thought that this was even more apparent once I added in the drums and the bass. You could hear that there was just something lacking. It was a bit emptier in the mix, and maybe this is to do with that slight attenuation at 2 kilohertz, but I'm not sure. It just doesn't sound like it's filling up the space it should be with distorted guitars. And last but not least was the ribbon microphone. So I actually really like the sound of this ribbon microphone on heavy guitars. Set back a little further from the amplifier, it still picks up a nice low end response, but it's got some of this edginess to it, grit, like in the high range that I can't really describe, but the 57 seems to lack. And it's this sound I've always been looking for when I've recorded guitars and couldn't quite get, but it's just there. It's like this chunkiness to it. And as I said in my review of that microphone, it kind of seems to pick up a natural sort of version of whatever you put in front of it. So if you have this gritty guitar tone, it's just going to pick that up. And that seems to me kind of what it's done. And once the ribbon is added in the mix with the bass and the guitars, I think it really holds up. It stands out in the mix without any effort, and it actually sounds a bit clearer than the 57 in the mix. It's a bit more present. So to me, that was my favorite, but let me know in the comment sections down below what you thought. So next up is a section I recorded with clean guitars. It was the exact same guitar setup, just running through a clean setting on the GD6 with a little bit of reverb. So let's get into those. So first up again was the 57, and I think it has this really nice low end response again to it. When it's soloed, it sounds quite nice, if a little bit dull, but sometimes that's what you want in the mix. And if there were some vocals maybe going on in this track, maybe it would actually be quite perfect, but I can't tell without the vocals. But it sounds a bit dull, but I don't mind it, but it could be a bit too dark almost. But it's not bad. Now next up was the S12, and in the recording it actually has a bit of noise going on, and I didn't actually hear that originally in the recording, unfortunately, but that was actually just due to some dirty power we had going on. So if you can, just kind of imagine that's not there. But what was actually cool in hindsight, the SM57 didn't really pick up that noise at all. But in this recording, forgetting the noise, the S12 actually sounds quite good, I thought, both on its own and in the mix. I think it picks up the brightness in the guitars a lot more. It picks up some of the detail in the reverb a bit more. It actually has a quite nice sound in the mix as well. It's got a nice space to it, so it's not bad at all. And I think what the S12 captured in the clean guitars is quite a lot more usable than what it had in the distorted guitars. guitars. And last again was the ribbon microphone, and I think it stands out again. It has this nice brightness to it. It just has this nice frequency response in the high end, and I really like that. And it sounds quite natural in the mix without having any processing at all. And either soloed or in the mix, I think it actually picked up a great sound. But it also picked up that noise again, but keep in mind that was just some dirty power issues I had going through all my equipment. But yeah, this one was much tougher to call. I think any of the 3 microphones could be used in a mix. I think all 3 of them sounded quite good on the clean guitars. It would just be maybe a preference thing and maybe a contrast thing. If you wanted a bit of a different sound between the chorus and the verse, you could use, say, the ribbon in the heavier guitars and the 57 or the S12 in the clean guitars, and that would give you some contrast without having to apply any EQ or any other processing. You'd just have it straight away. And that's what's cool about trying out new microphones. You can hear quite a difference between all 3 of them, and you can see where their strengths and weaknesses may be. And before you get to any processing, you can really muck around with some different mic choices to get some different sounds and get contrast between the different parts of the songs that you're recording. So I think that was a pretty interesting setup. Each microphone has their own unique sound, and you can hear that by their own unique design, they all have a very, very different sound. They have a very different frequency response, they have a very different response to the transients and different sound pressure levels, and overall they kind of just have a different feel, either soloed or in the mix. Let me know what you thought about this mic shootout in the comment section down below. I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. Maybe you'd like to see some different mic shootouts, maybe you'd like to see the same 3 mics on some different sound sources, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. And as always guys, please don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe down below. I'm Mitch from Revolution Music, and I'll catch you soon.